The millionaire was laughing when he suddenly lost control of his breath. It happened in the middle of the ballroom, just after he had made a quiet joke about the girl standing near the back wall. Her dress looked old, faded at the edges, and clearly not made for this event. People smiled politely at his comment. Some glanced at her with amusement. She did not speak. She only lowered her eyes and turned to leave. Then the glass dropped from his hand. His legs gave out. His expensive suit crumpled to the floor. At first, everyone froze. Wealth can protect many things, but it cannot stop time. No one moved. No one knew what to do. Except her. The same girl he had mocked walked back, faster than anyone else. She knelt beside the millionaire without fear. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. She did not look at the crowd. She only focused on saving him. Later, people would say they were all just in shock. But the truth was simple. In a room full of rich and powerful people, it was the girl in the wrong dress who acted with courage. The millionaire had laughed at her. But that moment was the beginning of everything he would come to respect, regret, and never forget. She had looked at the dress for a long time before deciding to wear it. It hung in the back of her small closet, protected by a plastic cover, the kind used to keep dust away. It was not made of silk. It was not designed by anyone famous. The label inside had faded years ago. The only reason she still had it was because it had once belonged to her mother, who had worn it to her first job interview after escaping a difficult past. It was not just a dress. It was a reminder of strength. When the invitation came, an unexpected message from the foundation that was hosting a ball for donors and scholarship winners, she did not know what to do. Her name had been added to the list last minute. She had never been inside a grand hotel ballroom. She had never stood among men and women whose watches cost more than her entire apartment. Still, she decided to go. She did not have time to shop for something new. And even if she did, she could not afford the kind of clothing that belonged in rooms like that. So she took out the old dress. She ironed it carefully, mended the seam on one sleeve, and chose a pair of simple black shoes. Her hair she tied back neatly, and the only jewelry she wore was a silver bracelet, one that had no diamonds, but held deep meaning for her. When she entered the ballroom, the lights nearly blinded her. The music, the laughter, the soft clinking of glasses, it all felt like another world. Every woman in the room sparkled. Every man looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. She walked slowly, not because she was nervous, but because she was trying to remember to breathe. That was when he noticed her. The millionaire stood across the room with his friends, dressed in a dark suit tailored to perfection. He had always been the center of attention at events like this. People laughed at his jokes. They followed his lead. And when his eyes landed on the girl in the lavender dress, his expression shifted. He whispered something under his breath, and his circle laughed quietly. She heard it. Of course she did. But she did not leave. She walked past them with quiet strength, her head high. She knew how she looked. She knew she did not belong by their standards. But she had come anyway. She came not to impress anyone, but to honor her mother's memory, to stand in the space she had earned through hard work, and to show herself that courage was not in appearance, but in presence. And as she passed the millionaire, he kept watching. Something about her stayed in his mind, though he did not yet know why. The laugh was not loud. It did not need to be. The most painful laughter often comes in quiet waves, passed between people with raised eyebrows and knowing smirks. That was exactly what happened the moment she stepped past the grand staircase. One woman whispered, then tilted her glass in the girl's direction. A man in a silver tie leaned toward the millionaire and said something under his breath. The millionaire chuckled. It was the kind of sound that carried across a room without trying. Everyone nearby followed with soft, practiced laughter. She heard it all. She did not need to look back to know it was about her. Her dress, her shoes, her very presence. It was easy to spot the difference between someone who belonged and someone who had simply been allowed to enter. She walked slower, not out of shame, but to gather the courage to keep going. Her heart beat harder, but her face remained calm. She reached for a glass of water on a nearby tray and stood near the edge of the crowd, where she could see but not be seen too much. The millionaire, still laughing, turned his head again. He expected her to leave. Most would have. In his world, silence from someone like her meant surrender. But instead, she remained. She did not glare. She did not fight back. She simply stood with her shoulders straight and her eyes ahead. That was when something changed. For a moment his smile faded. He looked at her again, this time without saying anything. She was not beautiful by their standards, not polished, not expensive. But there was something about her that made him pause. Perhaps it was the way she did not hide. Perhaps it was the strength that lived in her silence. Whatever it was, he noticed. And she noticed his shift, too. In that small exchange of glances, no words were spoken, but something new was formed. Not respect, not yet, but awareness. The kind that lingers in the back of the mind long after the moment has passed. Later that evening, when the music softened and the conversation shifted, he would glance in her direction again, not to mock this time, but to observe. Her presence, once laughed at, had become something more complicated. In a room full of people trying to shine, she had done nothing to attract attention. And yet, he could not stop looking. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. All he knew was that he had laughed too soon and looked too long. And for a man used to controlling every room he entered, that feeling unsettled him in a way he could not explain. It was not love, not even admiration. It was curiosity. And curiosity has a way of turning into something much deeper, especially when it comes from someone who has never been ignored. The night had grown quieter by the time she stepped out of the ballroom. The music still played behind the grand doors, and laughter still floated into the hall. But she had heard enough. Her shoes clicked gently on the marble as she walked past waiters, security guards, and polished sculptures without looking back. The air outside was colder than she expected, brushing against her arms as she crossed the entrance and moved toward the long line of cars. There was no one waiting for her, no personal driver, no sleek black car with her name on it. She pulled her phone from her purse to book a ride, but the screen was blank. The battery had died. She stood for a moment near the edge of the driveway, unsure what to do. Taxis were few, and the public transport was far. She did not want to call anyone. There was no one to call. The dress, now wrinkled from hours of sitting and standing, felt heavier on her shoulders. She considered walking. Then, out of nowhere, a voice called out from the back of a nearby car. A driver had stepped out and opened the rear door. "Miss," he said politely, pointing to the back seat. She hesitated. "You have the wrong person," she replied softly. But the voice from inside said otherwise. It was him, the millionaire. Sitting in the back seat with his jacket folded across his lap, his eyes no longer amused. He looked tired, thoughtful. "Get in. I will drop you off," he said. Not an order. Not a game. Just an offer. She hesitated again, but the cold air and the weight of the night pushed her forward. She stepped inside. The door closed, and silence filled the space between them. He did not speak. Neither did she. The city lights passed like silent waves through the tinted windows. For a while, the only sound was the gentle hum of the engine. He looked at her, not with curiosity this time, but with something quieter, something more unsure. "I did not mean to laugh," he said at last, his voice low. She did not reply. He was not looking for forgiveness, not really. He just needed to say it, and she let him. When the car stopped near her street, she opened the door without waiting, but before stepping out, she looked back. "Thank you," she said gently, and then closed the door behind her. The millionaire watched her walk toward a building with peeling paint and quiet windows. No security gates, no doormen. Just a simple place for someone who had chosen to face a difficult night with strength. He stayed parked there longer than he needed to. Something about her stayed with him. Not her dress, not her silence, but the way she sat beside him without trying to impress him, as if his presence meant nothing to her. and that was exactly what made him want to see her again. The next morning felt different. The ballroom had emptied, the champagne flutes had been collected, and the music had stopped hours ago, but the memory of her had not faded. The millionaire sat in his office, surrounded by marble walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and silence. He had meetings to attend, numbers to review, and decisions to make. But his mind returned, again and again, to the girl in the faded lavender dress. He realized he had never asked for her name. She had simply stepped out of the car and disappeared into the night like a character from a story left unfinished. He searched the guest list, but it was no help. Most names belonged to donors, investors, and socialites. She did not fit into those categories. He reached out to the foundation hosting the event, asking quietly about the late additions, the scholarship guests, anyone who might have received a last-minute invite. But even they had little information. The invitation had been sent by a junior staff member, someone who had found her application weeks ago and believed she deserved a seat in the room. There was no photo attached, no detailed file, just a handwritten name on an RSVP card. And when he saw it, something inside him paused. It was not an elegant name. It was not a name found on magazine covers or in circles of wealth. But it stayed with him. Clear, honest, unforgettable. Her name did not match the dress or the silence or the strength she had shown. But somehow, it made sense. He began calling in favors. Quietly. Carefully. He did not want to make it public. It was not about obsession. It was something else. Something he could not define. Every time he tried to move on, to focus on the usual flow of his perfectly designed life, her image returned. The steady look in her eyes. The way she sat in the car, unshaken, untouched by his wealth. For a man used to being the one who was remembered, it felt strange to be the one who could not forget. Days passed, then a week. Still, no progress. He began to think she had vanished. Perhaps she had never wanted to be found. Maybe she had seen his world and decided it had nothing to offer her. And maybe she was right. But just as he was beginning to let go, a message appeared on his assistant's desk. A community college name, a scholarship record, a class list. And there it was again, her name. Not written on a gold plaque. Not attached to luxury or status. Just printed on a sheet of paper like everyone else's. He folded the page and placed it in his pocket. He did not know what he would say. He only knew that he had to see her again. Because for the first time in a very long time, the millionaire felt that someone had walked through his world, not to ask for anything, but to remind him what was missing. The millionaire had visited hundreds of buildings in his life. Towers that bore his name, boardrooms wrapped in glass, hotels with golden elevators. But walking across the worn pavement of a small community college campus was something entirely new. There were no guards to open gates, no reserved parking spots, no polished greetings, just scattered students, cracked benches, and the distant buzz of a vending machine trying to work. He moved through the campus unnoticed. No one cared about the man in the tailored coat. They were too busy hurrying to class, sharing books, and checking the time. He liked that. It felt real, grounded. For the first time in years, he was not someone important, he was just someone walking. He found her name on a class list posted outside a low brick building. Her class had just ended. Students began filing out, laughing and shoving papers into bags. And then he saw her. She was the same, and yet different. Her hair was tied back in the same simple way, and she wore no makeup, no jewelry. Just a gray sweater, jeans, and a backpack that looked far too heavy. She walked beside another girl, talking softly. She was smiling. He stood back and watched. She had no idea he was there. She walked across the quad, stopped to pick up a flyer that had fallen, and handed it back to a student she did not even know. She waved goodbye to her friend, then crossed toward the library. He followed from a distance. He was not sure what he was hoping to find, but every small action she took seemed to say something louder than words ever could. She helped the door stay open for a boy with crutches. She returned a book before the deadline. She nodded at the cleaning lady as if they were equals. There was no performance, no effort to impress. And in those quiet gestures, he saw what he had missed. He had spent his life in spaces where power was measured in cars, watches, and influence, where kindness was often calculated and generosity came with conditions. But here, in the simple rhythm of her day, he saw something different. She did not just exist. She gave, without expectation, without fear. He did not approach her that day. He did not introduce himself or remind her of the night at the ball. He just watched her return to her world, a world that was smaller than his, but somehow felt larger in meaning. When he finally turned to leave, he felt strange, humbled, awakened. There was no need to own anything here to matter. She had nothing, and yet she carried herself like someone who had everything that could not be bought. He had come looking for answers, maybe even a way to impress her. But instead, he left carrying something unexpected, a lesson she had never meant to teach, but one he would never forget. The invitation was handwritten. No company seal, no assistant's signature, no formal heading, just his own words on clean stationery. He had asked for nothing extravagant, no mention of where he came from or what he owned. It simply said, "Would you have dinner with me?" No expectations, just a conversation. It was delivered through someone he trusted at the college, quietly slipped into her mailbox between assignment deadlines and flyers about part-time jobs. He did not know if she would respond. And if she did not, he had already decided he would not try again. He would respect that. But 3 days later, a message came through. She would meet him. One dinner. One evening. He booked a place that was elegant, but not overwhelming. No chandeliers, no photographers waiting outside. Just warm lights, polished wood, and enough quiet to speak without shouting. He arrived early, nervously early, and waited with a stillness unfamiliar to him. His hands moved over the folded napkin again and again. When she entered, she did not dress like she was trying to match the space. She wore what made her comfortable, a dark green dress, modest, simple. She looked around once, saw him, and offered a quiet smile. They talked, slowly at first, about the night of the ball, about how strange the world can be when two people from different lives cross paths in such a public, unforgiving way. He apologized, not just for the laughter, but for the assumptions. She accepted, not because she wanted to let him off easy, but because she had long ago learned the difference between a moment of cruelty and a person's whole truth. Then the conversation deepened. She told him about her life, about growing up with little but never feeling small, about books that made her dream, about working shifts at a diner to pay for school, and how she still made time to tutor students who were struggling more than she was. She spoke with calm strength, as if her life had taught her to carry burdens without complaint. He listened in a way he rarely did, not with the habit of a man waiting to speak, but with the quietness of someone realizing he had much to learn. The dinner stretched longer than expected. Time disappeared somewhere between the second course and the shared story of her first job. She laughed once, and he remembered it more than any toast he had ever received in rooms filled with applause. When she stood to leave, he did not ask to walk her out. He only stood too, grateful, quiet. She thanked him, not for the meal, but for the space to be heard. And as she walked away into the night, he knew something had shifted. It was not a romance he had planned. It was a realization he had not expected, that in all his success, this was the first time he felt truly seen by someone who had nothing to gain and everything to offer. The days that followed were not filled with dramatic changes. There were no confessions or sudden declarations. Instead, there were small moments, quiet messages, brief meetings, and the occasional cup of coffee shared without planning. The millionaire, once surrounded by noise and constant movement, began to notice how stillness could be its own kind of wealth. He started driving himself instead of calling a driver. He began answering his own phone. It was not because he had to. It was because something inside him wanted to feel life in its raw form. without layers of people protecting him from it. He saw her once outside a bookstore. She was helping an older woman carry her bag up a small flight of stairs. Another time, she was handing out sandwiches with a volunteer group. She never told him about these things. He only saw them by chance. And each time, he found himself questioning everything he had believed success meant. Then one evening, after walking her home from a modest cafe, they stood quietly outside her apartment building. It was not an elegant place. The paint had faded and the lights flickered in the hallway. But she smiled as she turned to him and said, "Do you ever get tired of being treated like a millionaire?" The question landed heavier than she likely meant it to. He looked at her, unsure how to respond. People had always admired his money, respected it, feared it, envied it. But no one had ever asked if he was tired of it, of being seen as a title instead of a man. In that moment he realized he had no idea how to answer. She waited, not impatiently, just openly. He finally said, "Sometimes I do not know where the money ends and I begin." She nodded, like she understood. And perhaps she did, better than anyone else ever had. That night, he went home to his penthouse, stared out over a city glowing with lights, and for the first time, he felt something hollow beneath all the brightness. His success had given him everything except the ability to feel ordinary, to be seen without a filter, to be questioned not about deals or stocks, but about who he was when all of that was stripped away. Her question stayed with him, lingering not just in his mind, but in his daily choices. He began changing things quietly, letting go of excess, paying more attention to the people who worked behind the scenes of his empire. He started showing up where he was not expected, listening more than speaking. It was not a crisis. It was a turning point. One sentence from someone who had nothing had stirred something in someone who had everything. And for a man who once believed he had all the answers, the real wealth had just begun to reveal itself, through a question he never saw coming. It arrived in a plain envelope, slipped under her door with no return address and no note inside. Just a folded letter and a key. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to feel confused, curious, or afraid. The letter was brief, handwritten again, just like the invitation had been. It said only this: no expectations, just opportunity. Use it however you wish, or do not use it at all. The key was gold, but simple, not decorated or labeled, and with it, an address. She visited the location 2 days later, partly because her curiosity would not let her sleep. It was a small building, 2 floors, brick, clean, but aging. It sat quietly at the edge of a neighborhood she had passed through many times on the bus, and when she stepped inside, she understood. The place had once been a bookstore. Dusty shelves still lined the walls. The space was empty now, except for the soft scent of old paper that lingered in the floorboards. A fresh coat of paint had been added, the floors polished, and new light fixtures hung from the ceiling. The key opened the door without resistance. She found a second envelope waiting on the front counter. This time, it contained more details. Documents that confirmed the building had been purchased under her name, the first year of taxes already paid, the utilities ready to be activated. There were permits attached, licenses to operate a nonprofit, to run classes, to open a cafe if she wanted. Everything was optional, nothing was forced. She sat on the floor for a long time, overwhelmed. The millionaire had never spoken to her about this. He had never hinted or promised anything. He had only listened, only watched. And somehow he had known that her dream had always been quiet, not to climb ladders of power, but to create a space where others like her could learn, read, be safe. This was not a gift wrapped in luxury. It was not dripping with diamonds or fame. It was freedom. The kind of freedom no amount of money could fake. She could say no. She could walk away. But she would not. Later, when she saw him again, she thanked him. Not because she felt obligated, but because she knew what it meant to give without needing control. He simply nodded. "I did not do it for you," he said gently. I did it because the world needs more of what you carry." The door she opened that day was more than just a building entrance. It was a passage into something larger, a space where her story could grow beyond hardship, beyond judgment, a place not to escape her past, but to honor it. And all because one man, who once only knew how to give to be admired, finally gave for the right reason. Months passed. The building that once stood silent and empty had transformed into a space filled with energy and purpose. Children gathered in the reading corner after school. Young adults, who had once believed college was out of reach, now attended weekend classes. A coffee machine buzzed gently in the background while soft conversations filled the air. Laughter lived where dust once did. And at the center of it all was her, calm, focused, still wearing the same humble clothes, still walking through each room as though it were never really hers, only borrowed for the sake of others. The millionaire never asked for credit. His name was not on the door. He only visited once in a while, sitting quietly in the back as if he were just another guest. But those who noticed him could always tell. He was proud, not in the way of ownership, but in the way a gardener watches something bloom that he once only imagined as seed. Then came the night that no one had planned, but everyone would remember. It was a small fundraiser, nothing grand, folding chairs, homemade desserts, string lights hung by volunteers. But somehow, it felt more beautiful than any gala. She gave a short speech, grateful, warm, filled with hope. And just as she stepped off the small stage, the lights flickered once, and someone stepped forward from the crowd. The millionaire, not in a tuxedo, not flanked by assistants or photographers, just him, holding a small notebook in his hand. He spoke only briefly. He said he had spent his life in rooms where people talked about changing the world, but very few ever meant it, and that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that carries the weight of real change. Then he handed her the notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, his own reflections, stories, lessons, and ideas collected since the night they met. It was his way of saying thank you for waking him up, for reminding him what wealth was really meant for. She hugged him in front of everyone, not as a gesture of spectacle, but as a moment of truth. There was no past to erase now, no pride left to protect. Full Circle did not look like the richest man marrying the girl who had nothing. It looked like two people standing on equal ground, both transformed by what they had quietly given each other. As the music started again and the night moved on, one thing became clear. This was not the story of a man rescuing a woman, or a woman softening a hardened heart. It was a story of what happens when ego steps aside and humanity steps forward. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that change does not always come wrapped in diamonds or power, then let this not be the last story you hear. Subscribe to the channel, because here we tell stories where wealth meets heart, and kindness writes the ending.